There's probably no aspect of individual freedom that's more celebrated than freedom of speech. The right to express our opinions and advocate for our beliefs is a basic part of how we live in a constitutional democracy. But there's also a lot of misunderstanding about how free speech really works. And a lot of that misunderstanding centers around a slogan that you often hear people use, the marketplace of ideas. A marketplace of ideas sounds like a good thing. It comes from a Supreme Court case that's more than a century old, in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said the government should not punish people for expressing their views about American involvement in overseas wars. Now, we'd probably all agree that the government shouldn't censor that sort of thing. But the phrase marketplace of ideas actually conceals a really dangerous misunderstanding about how free speech works. You see, in the United States, we pretty much take it for granted that you can criticize the government or powerful politicians and public figures, and we sometimes forget how rare that freedom really is. Most people in the world have nowhere near that kind of freedom.
In China, for example, the government even bans pictures of Winnie the Pooh because the country's dictator looks like him, and critics like to point that out. Imagine banning Winnie the Pooh.
The American system of free speech has a really dramatic history. It goes back to 17th century England and an argument over laws called licensing or prior restraints. Parliament made it illegal to publish a book without getting the government's permission first.
In 1644, the poet John Milton, best remembered for the book Paradise Lost, published a book arguing that divorce ought to be legalized. He didn't get a license before publishing that book, and that didn't go over well. Parliament began investigating him. So he published another book called Areopagitica, arguing that the entire licensing law should just be abolished. That book remains to this day the most beautiful defense of free speech ever published.
If truth is in the field, wrote Milton, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worst in a free and open encounter. Milton thought the government did not need to censor falsehoods. If something isn't true, people will point that out, and the lie will be defeated as long as people are free to openly argue. On the other hand, Milton said, if the government does start deciding what people can and cannot publish, it will eventually prioritize its own power over the actual truth. Bureaucrats are no good at censorship because they often know less about the subjects than the writers do, and because bureaucrats consider it more important to protect their own power than to discover what's actually true or false. It took decades before the laws were changed and Britain got rid of licensing. But by the time of the American Revolution, it was clear that you couldn't be prevented from publishing something. You could still be punished afterward, however. So there were still plenty of limits on free speech. By our standards, British law remained very oppressive. But the elimination of prior restraints meant Britain had the strongest free speech protections in the world at the time. Americans took freedom of speech even more seriously. In the 1730s, a New York newspaperman named John Peter Zenger was put on trial for criticizing the government of the colony, and the jury refused to convict him. That case showed that the colonists were taking the idea of free speech and running with it. They wanted writers and speakers to be able to criticize politicians without fear of prosecution. Of course, Americans have experienced our share of censorship over the years. There was the Sedition Act during John Adams' presidency, for example, which made it a crime to criticize the president. Andrew Jackson effectively banned abolitionists from sending anti-slavery newspapers through the mail. And during both World Wars, it was a crime to speak out against a military draft. The government even created official censorship agencies. Nevertheless, compared to the rest of the world, Americans have usually enjoyed the broadest possible freedom of speech.
But why? It seems strange to say, but even to this day, there's a lot of disagreement about why we protect free speech. Do we protect freedom of speech for society's sake or for the sake of the individual?
James Madison, who wrote the First Amendment, gave one explanation. He said, our opinions are like property. Property applies not just to our physical possessions, but also to our ideas. Each person has a property in his opinions and the free communication of them. In other words, I own my thoughts, and I can do with them what I want. The government has no right to take that away, any more than it has a right to take away my watch or my house. But in the 20th century, political philosophers began saying that our rights are really just permissions government gives to us, not for our sake, but for its own purposes. Freedom of speech isn't something we have a basic moral right to. Instead, it's something government gives us in order to enable democracy to work. And that's where the phrase marketplace of ideas comes from. In 1919, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote an opinion where he said, quote, "The best test of truth is the power of the thought to get itself accepted in the competition of the market. And therefore, a democracy gives people freedom of speech so that they can debate and argue things out and see which ideas prevail." Now that seems right. After all, the reason we debate things is so that we can hear the arguments on either side, and it's certainly important for everyone to have their say so we can decide what to do. But that cannot be the whole story, because there are all sorts of speech that we do not think of as being in the public marketplace. Writing in a diary, for example, or writing a poem to express yourself, or a private conversation with your doctor, or not speaking at all. These things don't really fit into this model of a marketplace.
In fact, the marketplace idea can actually be used to stifle free speech. In 1940, the U.S. Supreme Court heard a case involving laws that required school children to pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. A family of Jehovah's Witnesses challenged this law because they said that it violated their religious freedom, and they were expelled for refusing to pledge allegiance to the flag.
The court ruled in favor of the government. One reason it did so was because of the marketplace of ideas theory. The justices said that the children's refusing to pledge allegiance did not count as participating in democracy. It wasn't playing any real role in the marketplace of ideas. In fact, to compel kids to pledge allegiance would encourage democratic conversation, and that was a good thing. In other words, we should force people into this marketplace of ideas. 3 years later, the court overruled that decision in another lawsuit involving the Pledge of Allegiance. This time it said that people have a right not to participate in the marketplace of ideas if they don't want to. The purpose of a Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, wrote Justice Robert Jackson. One's right to life, liberty, and property, to free speech, a free press, freedoms of worship and assembly may not be submitted to vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. That's true, but that's the opposite of the marketplace theory. That's the old Madisonian theory, that we protect free speech for individual purposes, not for the sake of society.
Still today, there's this tension over why we protect free speech. Do we do it because a person owns his or her own ideas, as James Madison said? Or is freedom of speech a privilege given to us by the government for democracy's sake, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said?
And you see that tension today when people talk about so-called censorship by social media companies like Twitter or Facebook. These companies are being accused of violating free speech because they refuse to allow certain types of comments on their websites or ban certain political leaders from using their apps. But is that really a violation of free speech? Or is it just an example of free speech? If speech is something the government gives to us or takes away from us in order to serve democracy, then a company like Twitter should be forced to let us use its platform, right? After all, that would increase discussion and serve democracy. But if speech is something like property, so that we own our free expression, then Twitter should be allowed to block anyone it wants to from using the app because it owns the app. And if you don't like it, you can start your own company. In fact, some people have already done that with companies like Truth Social. The philosopher Ayn Rand put the point succinctly. Freedom of speech means freedom from interference, suppression, or punitive action by the government, and nothing else. It does not mean the right to demand the material means to express your views at the expense of other people who may not wish to support you.
After all, the people who own Twitter have free speech rights too, and they have the right to decide what speech they're willing to broadcast and what they're not. We can criticize them for that and even accuse them of canceling people, but in the end, it's their right to decide.
The problem gets messier when you're talking about speech subsidized by the government, like at public universities. When a government-run university blocks somebody from giving a speech on campus because of his political opinions, or forces students to say they agree with something they don't, then the state is using force to limit what people can say, or forcing them to say things that they don't believe. And that does violate freedom of speech. Of course, it's true that free speech is important in democracy, because silencing one side of an argument will lead to a distorted idea of what public opinion really is. But we don't have freedom of speech because of this. Instead, we have freedom of speech because we are fundamentally free as individuals. And that means that even speech that serves no democratic goal is still deserving of protection.